Readers of Faith Bar of Life may have noticed that I made a comment in passing in my recent article, which was a review of McGlasson's book, No, A Theological Response to Christian Reconstruction, and I made a comment about politics, at least in passing, and I pointed out the predilections for some Reconstructionists politically, and then pointed out some Purists see it differently. And then, of course, I'm really alluding there to a wide spectrum of opinion held by those who are theonomists, or those who hold to the validity of Old Testament law, to the law of God, its perpetual abiding. And there seems to be different approaches to the political question and how that plays out. So you have what's known as incrementalism, those who are willing to take a small amount of progress at a time to push back the darkness, versus those who are not willing to compromise at any step and holding out for the absolute purity of what God requires in the leader. And so I was respectful for both positions. I acknowledged them both, but I didn't make a judgment one way or the other as to, one, where I stood on the question, which wasn't really relevant to the topic, or two, is it Chalcedon's business necessarily to rule on these two matters? I do think that we are beholden to the Scriptures in all respects, and so to that end I'd like to address a couple of comments. It was common in the early era of American Christianity for election sermons to be preached, and one of the most common texts preached upon was 2 Samuel 23, the second and third verses. And it's a very powerful passage. I'd like you to grasp what it says. This is David's last words, in effect. And he said, "The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spake to me, He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God." Let's hear that again. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Now, David knew exactly what just meant, because justice shalt thou do, from Deuteronomy 16:20. And the laws that were to be followed by the king were reiterated in the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy. Here we have basically a requirement being laid down by God for those that rule over men. Not only are they to rule over men in terms of the law of God, in terms of godly justice, they are also to rule in the fear of God. In other words, fear of men, which is a snare, doesn't activate or motivate them. Fear of God, which purifies them and keeps them far above all arrogance and bribery. Consequently, there are two requirements laid down in Scripture for those who rule over men. I do not believe it's possible to evade these at any step in the process. If it's a must, it's a must. So in essence, I do believe that we need to look more closely, or at least veer toward the purist side in terms of what they're trying to seek. However, here it becomes more interesting, because it is possible for someone to fulfill this requirement of 2 Samuel 23 and yet not pass muster with the purists. For example, we may not be satisfied with their answer in respect to certain matters of civil magistracy and the function of government, even though they would rule justly and rule in the fear of God. In other words, they would apply the law of God insofar as it is revealed to men to apply it. This is interesting to me because it suggests that theonomists are a little bit behind their game. We Reconstructionists want to talk about the importance of the law of God, but we have precious little experience in bringing the law of God to bear on a society. We need to be workmen approved, not ashamed. Too many knee-jerk reactions and quick off-the-cuff comments seem to be marking our approach. And I think the dangerous step is to be expedient in either direction. Note that it was expediency that sent Christ to the cross. It's expedient for one man to die, then the whole nation perish, as Caiaphas prophesied in the Gospel of John. Far be it from us to follow similar footsteps in our political leanings today. And yet most of us are very willing to throw certain people or groups under the bus for political gain. I'm not sure the Lord is going to honor that. I think each of us must reconsider fully what our mission is as Christians. We do have to answer to God for this verse when we stand before Him. I think that would motivate us to the highest standards of argument and not justifications for compromise or perfectionism on the other extreme. The truth may lie somewhere in the middle. Neither side wants to hear this, and I think we need to be more patient and considerate. If justice is required, and we are not using the ballot box as a means to achieve godly justice, where will we stand before God when we become agents of injustice and expedience toward something less than what God requires. Does that mean that you might be outvoted 100 to 1? Well, I know of one prophet in Scripture, Micaiah, who was outvoted over 400 to 1, but he was right, and God stood by his word to that prophet. Perhaps if more of us were more courageous and not so cowardly or willing to bend to public opinion or to the opinions of men, and not to follow after multitudes to do potential evil. I'm not saying actual, but one must wonder. Our propensity to follow crowds and multitudes and movements is not speaking well of us as those who stand upon Christ and his foundation alone. I think we need to reconsider the foundations of our faith, recognize that we are but babes in the woods when it comes to applying this stuff. Sure, we talk about the great Christians of the 1600s and 1700s in Scotland and America, elsewhere. But do we have what they have? I don't see us generating the kind of output in terms of biblical commentary and studies that the Puritans did. We still do paperbacks that are relatively quick, easy reads. Maybe when we're in a position to write like John Owen writes, where our pastors had that caliber, are we ready to be serious about applying our faith to politics? This does not abjure us of any obligation to do so today, but I think it compounds the necessity for us to study to show ourselves workmen approved. Unfortunately, too many are workmen ashamed, and they don't even know it yet, which doubles the shame and the damage to God's kingdom in the meantime. Therefore, I issue a call to all Christians to examine themselves and to examine the Scriptures and to wonder if they've not taken the matter too lightly, and all the flurry of political urgency has made a shambles of our faith.